Ever feel like the world is changing faster than you can keep up? Like, so fast you can't even process it.
I think we can all relate to that feeling.
Yeah, right. Well, get this. That feeling, it's not new.
No.
Nope, not at all. Today, we're diving into a period of history, like way back, that basically birthed the modern age. We're talking revolutions, upheavals, the whole shebang.
Sounds intense.
Oh, it is. And you might be surprised at how much it echoes what we're going through today.
I'm intrigued.
Think of this deep dive as your cheat sheet to understanding how we got here. By the way, this whole thing's narrated by AI, so you can listen and learn anytime, anywhere.
Wow, technology. Okay, so where are we starting? What era are we talking about?
Great question. We're going to be exploring this book by Paul Johnson called The Birth of the Modern.
Catchy title.
Right. It unpacks, this whole pivotal era. Events, personalities, even those everyday details that we usually kind of gloss over.
The stuff that brings it to life.
Exactly. And we're starting with something you might not expect. The Treaty of Ghent.
The Treaty of Ghent, remind me.
1814. It ended the War of 1812 between the U.S. and Britain.
Ah, okay, right.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. On the surface, it was a draw. Both sides basically went back to where they were before the war started.
A draw, really?
Yep. But the unspoken agreement was that both the U.S. and Britain would expand westward.
Ah, so that's where the rivalry for the West really kicks off.
Exactly. That's the thing about this treaty. A draw, but it actually set the stage for like a whole century of growth and expansion.
For both of them.
Yep, for both.
Yeah.
It was like, okay, we see you, you see us, we both want this, let's go.
Yeah.
Kind of acknowledge their rivalry, but also their ambition.
So it's a good example of how, even when there's conflict, diplomacy can set the stage for future cooperation.
It makes you wonder what unspoken agreements are, shaping the world today.
Definitely. So Treaty of Ghent, what else is going on in this birth of the modern era?
Well, Johnson takes us across the Atlantic to a figure who, honestly, embodies both ambition and, downfall.
And who would that be?
Napoleon Bonaparte. I mean, his story is just insane. Emperor too, get this, exile.
Napoleon, talk about a rise and fall.
Right, his rise, it was meteoric. Military genius, plus just this hunger for power. But that ambition, that's ultimately his undoing.
Yeah, didn't Napoleon eventually lose it all in Russia?
Totally. The Russian campaign of 1812, it was a disaster.
I remember reading about it. Brutal winter, lack of supplies, just devastating losses.
And Johnson captures all of that. That retreat from Russia, turning point for Napoleon, exposed the limits of his power and, it emboldened his enemies.
Sure, I bet. Who were some of the key players who saw an opportunity here?
Tsar Alexander I and Talleyrand, they were, looking to reshape Europe after Napoleon's fall.
Okay, so how'd they do that?
The Congress of Vienna.
The Congress of Vienna.
Johnson describes it as like a giant chess game. Diplomacy, power plays, the whole thing.
So what? They're just trying to establish some stability after all the chaos.
That was the goal, but they also, they have their own agendas too.
Of course, and I bet that led to some unintended consequences.
Oh, totally. One of those. The rise of German nationalism. Figures like Karl von Stein.
Karl von Stein, he was.
He was a key figure in this, dreamed of a unified German state. And Napoleon's conquests. He saw them as like this catalyst for German unity. Ironic, right?
It is. Trying to create stability, but unintentionally sparking new movements.
Exactly. It's like history it keeps repeating itself in these weird ways.
So, okay, we've got political upheaval, but it sounds as there's also a lot of change happening on a personal level.
Oh, yeah. Johnson introduces us to this guy, Ludwig von Beethoven.
Beethoven. His music is everywhere.
I know, right? Genius, no question. But what makes Johnson's account so compelling is, he connects Beethoven's struggles, personal struggles, to his artistic triumphs, deafness, crazy relationships, even his quirks, they all feed into the music.
It's like the suffering fuels the art.
In a way, yeah. There's this one story, right, about Beethoven composing the Credo for his Mass in D. His friends, they could hear him through the door, locked doors, singing, howling, and stamping as he wrestled with this fugue.
Wow, that's some serious creative intensity.
Right. Passion and, just sheer force of will, even with all the adversity he faced. And that intensity is reflected in the music, breaking with tradition, ushering in this new era of musical expression.
Okay, so Beethoven, challenging conventions. Who else is shaking things up in the world of music during this time?
Another giant, Gioacchino Rossini. He took the opera world by storm, energy, prolific output. I mean, the guy just knew how to tap into like the changing tastes of the audience.
He sounds like a rock star of his time.
Totally. His operas, they were these lavish productions, drama, spectacle, and those melodies, audiences couldn't get enough of them. Johnson describes his collaborations with this stage designer, Alessandro Sanchirico, at La Scala.
La Scala.
That's legendary. These were like grand spectacles pushing the boundaries of what opera could even be.
So like a true innovator.
Oh, yeah, and a larger-than-life character, too. Witty, charming, and, he could be a diva. There's this story about him refusing to bow to the Prince Regent's wife.
He sounds like he had a bit of an attitude.
Well, he knew his worth, right? Like Beethoven, he wasn't afraid to challenge conventions, both in the music and in his personal life.
I like that. So we've got the music scene evolving. What other areas were being transformed during this period?
Transportation. This is where the contrast with, our world today is just crazy.
Okay, so set the scene. What's transportation like in the early 1800s?
Imagine, right? The fastest way to travel, horse-drawn carriage, on bumpy, often, poorly maintained roads.
Doesn't sound very comfortable.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Johnson describes these journeys, arduous, uncomfortable, and often dangerous. Nothing like the speed and comfort we're used to.
So not a quick trip to the store.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
But even amidst all that, there were these visionaries, right? People who were pushing the boundaries.
Anyone in particular come to mind?
Thomas Kelford. He built the world's fastest road at the time. Innovative techniques, materials, the whole thing.
So how did he do it? What made his road so special?
Meticulous surfaces, a whole network of bridges, tunnels, cut travel time, significantly.
So he's opening up new possibilities for trade, communication, all of that.
Exactly. And while Telford's revolutionizing land travel, there's this guy, Robert Fulton. He's doing the same thing, but for rivers.
Rivers!
Yeah. With his work on steamboats.
Steamboats. That must have been mind-blowing back then.
Talk about disruptive technology. They were faster, more efficient, and way more reliable than traditional boats.
And I bet they had a huge impact on trade and travel, right?
Huge. Open up these vast stretches of rivers. And they weren't just changing how people traveled, they were changing how people interacted with, the whole world.
Okay, so transportation is undergoing a major shift. What about the social landscape? What's happening there?
Oh, another major transformation. We see the rise of the middle class. Cities are growing like crazy, fueled by industrialization, and people, they're moving from rural areas.
Creating all sorts of new opportunities.
Exactly. And with that rise comes this growing sense of, power and influence. People start demanding a say in how they're governed. And that's where things get interesting.
I can imagine.
This whole thing plays out, you can see it in the Queen Caroline affair in Britain. The public, they rallied behind the Queen, who was, get this, accused of adultery by her husband, King George I.
Wow. Okay, that sounds juicy.
It was a huge scandal. But it wasn't just gossip. It revealed the growing power of public opinion in challenging the monarchy.
So people were starting to question the traditional authority of the monarchy.
Big time. Traditional hierarchies were being challenged. New voices were starting to be heard. And this spirit of change, it wasn't just limited to politics.
Where else did it show up?
Science and technology. Figures like Humphrey Davy.
Wasn't he a chemist?
Yeah. Revolutionized chemistry. And then there's Charles Babbage. This guy, he basically envisioned a future shaped by, get this, computing machines.
Are we talking like computers back then?
Early stages, but yeah. It's incredible to think that the seeds of our digital age were being planted back then.
Babbage must have been way ahead of his time.
Totally. He saw the potential, right?
Yeah.
Machines performing these complex calculations, freeing up humans, paving the way for discoveries and advancements. Amazing, right?
Absolutely amazing. It makes you wonder what other incredible advancements were happening during this time.
That's what we're going to dive into next.
It's like we're seeing the building blocks of the world we live in today.
It is. It really is. But these advancements weren't happening in a vacuum. Johnson reminds us that this was also a time of great uncertainty and turmoil, especially for certain groups.
Like who?
Well, he talks about the challenges faced by Native Americans as the U.S. expanded westward.
Right, the push for manifest destiny.
Exactly. The lure of land and opportunity. It drew settlers westward. But, that expansion came at a cost.
Of course. Native American tribes were displaced, their land was taken, and their cultures disrupted.
A complex and often tragic chapter in American history. It's like progress, but at what price?
Definitely something to think about.
And in the midst of all this, there's a new political force emerging. Jacksonian democracy. And at the center of it all, Andrew Jackson.
Ah, old hickory.
The guy was a populist leader, championed the common man, challenged those established elites.
Jackson, he was a real force to be reckoned with. I mean, he transformed American politics.
Completely. His presidency, it was a turning point. We see a shift toward a more inclusive democracy, but it also, well, it exposed the deep divisions within American society. Issues like slavery, states' rights,
It's interesting how those tensions from Jackson's era still echo in American politics today. It's like some things never really change.
Right, history rhyming. Anyway, Johnson then takes us to another part of the world where those traditional power structures are being challenged. The Ottoman Empire.
Ah, the sick man of Europe.
Exactly. The Greek Revolution. It erupted in 1821. Pivotal moment in this whole era of upheaval.
The Greeks, they were, fighting for independence from the Ottomans?
They'd been under Ottoman rule for centuries, and now, inspired by the Enlightenment and, just this burning desire for freedom, they rose up in rebellion.
And didn't this conflict draw a lot of international attention?
It did. People across Europe, they were fascinated by it. Even the poet Lord Byron, he joined the fight.
Wow, Lord Byron. Talk about a celebrity endorsement.
Right. It speaks to the romanticism of the era, this idea of fighting for freedom against an oppressive empire. It captured people's imaginations.
Sure, I bet. A real-life David and Goliath story.
Totally. And the Greek Revolution, it highlighted the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Once a mighty power, now struggling to hold on to its vast territories.
So this is a sign of, the shifting global power dynamics that were happening at the time.
Absolutely. New nations emerging, empires declining. The whole world order is kind of in flux.
Okay, so we've got these huge historical shifts happening. But how were these changes playing out in the lives of everyday people?
Great question. Johnson dives into that too. He explores the changing nature of social class and the growing influence of, public opinion.
Interesting. So how were social classes changing during this period?
Think about it this way. In the past, social hierarchies, they were rigid, right? Your place in society was pretty much determined by birth.
You were born into your class, and that was pretty much it.
Exactly. But during this period, those lines start to blur.
Why is that? What's driving this change?
Well, you've got the rise of the middle class, the growth of cities, the spread of new ideas. It's all challenging the old ways of thinking. And one of the most striking examples of this shift, the Queen Caroline affair in Britain.
The Queen Caroline affair. Remind me.
It was a scandal. King George I, he tries to publicly divorce his queen.
Publicly?
Oh, yeah. Accuses her of adultery, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And the public. They ate it up. Newspapers, pamphlets, even street protests. The whole country is talking about it. But it goes beyond gossip. People took sides.
Sounds like a real-life soap opera.
Totally. And in a way, Queen Caroline, despite her flaws, she becomes this symbol of resistance against the king.
It's like the people are using this scandal to push back against the monarchy.
Exactly. It showed that public opinion, it mattered. The monarchy can no longer ignore the voice of the people.
So the Queen Caroline affair shows how public opinion was becoming a force to be reckoned with.
Big time. And this growing awareness of public sentiment, it also plays a role in the fight for Catholic emancipation in Britain.
Yeah.
Catholics, they were pushing for greater religious freedom and, political rights.
So these social and political movements, they're all kind of intertwined.
They are. They're feeding off of each other, creating this groundswell of change. But Johnson, he also doesn't shy away from the darker sides of this era. He talks about transportation.
I thought we already talked about transportation, like the roads and steamboats.
No, this is different. We're talking about the convict transportation system.
Convicts.
Yeah, this was a brutal system. Think about it. Convicts, a lot of them for minor offenses, shipped off to penal colonies like Australia.
Separated from their families, forced into these horrific conditions.
It was rough. Johnson highlights the despair, the hardship they faced. But he also highlights those stories of resilience.
Like what?
He talks about this guy, Simeon Lord, transported to Australia for stealing cloth.
Stealing cloth?
Yeah. But get this. He ends up building a successful business empire in Sydney.
Wow. Talk about turning things around.
Right. It's a testament to the human spirit to adapt and thrive even in the face of adversity.
Okay, so transportation, social change. What else is happening in this birth of the modern era?
Science. Johnson highlights the work of this guy, Humphrey Davy, rock star in the world of chemistry.
Chemistry, huh? What did he do?
Davy, he wasn't just a brilliant scientist. He was also this master communicator. His lectures on chemistry, they drew huge crowds.
So he was kind of like a celebrity scientist.
Totally. People were fascinated by his experiments, his ability to, like, explain complex concepts in a way that everyone could understand.
I can see the appeal.
Right. He understood that science needed to be relevant to, well, to everyday life. He even worked with miners to develop this safer lamp, reduce the risk of explosions.
Sounds like he was a real humanitarian using his knowledge to help others.
He was. And that spirit of innovation, we also see it in the work of Charles Babbage. This guy, he had this vision of a mechanical computer.
Computer? Back then, no way.
I know, right? His difference engine, it was revolutionary. He foresaw a future where machines could perform all these complex calculations, freeing humans up for, other tasks.
So he was essentially laying the groundwork for the computer revolution.
Exactly. Even though his machine, well, it never really got off the ground due to, like, funding issues and technological limitations.
I can imagine trying to build a computer back then must have been quite the challenge.
No kidding. But his ideas, they stuck around. They paved the way for everything we have today.
It makes you wonder what other visionary ideas from this era might still be out there just waiting to be rediscovered.
That is a great question.
It really is amazing to see how far we've come.
I know, right? But progress, well, it's rarely a straight line.
True enough.
Johnson, he dives into these contradictions. Like, you've got this incredible progress in science, technology, and social awareness.
Right, we've talked about all that.
But at the same time, you've got widespread poverty, inequality, conflict. It's a messy time.
Definitely a time of both progress and, setbacks.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, Johnson, he delves into some personal stories. For instance, Thomas Coutts, a wealthy banker, marries his mistress.
His mistress?
Yeah, Mrs. Mellon. Causes a huge scandal in high society.
I bet. So even amidst all these grand historical events, there's still this personal drama unfolding.
Oh, yeah. Johnson, he gives us these glimpses into everyday life, right? Shows how social norms and customs, they're also evolving along with these big historical shifts.
So what kind of changes are we talking about in everyday life?
Well, one area Johnson explores is the rise of novels.
Novels, interesting.
People are reading more than ever before. Circulating libraries, they're popping up everywhere, making books accessible to a wider audience.
So books aren't just for the elite anymore.
Exactly. Even Jane Austen's family, Johnson points out that they were big novel readers.
I love Jane Austen.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to think about, right? How this spread of literacy, it's shaping the cultural landscape.
It's like a whole new world of ideas and perspectives is opening up to people.
Exactly. And speaking of education, Johnson points out that back then, a lot of kids were educated at home.
At home, like homeschooled.
Especially those from wealthy families. Isolated from other kids, often with, like, tutors and governesses.
That's so different from how we think about education today.
Yeah, I know, right? There's this anecdote about W.E. Forster.
Wasn't he a big advocate for, public education?
Yeah, in England. But as a boy, he was educated at home by his mother and some clergymen.
So no formal schooling.
Nope. And get this, by the age of 12, he's reading political journals and keeping a diary.
Wow. So even without, traditional schooling, people could still become incredibly well educated.
It makes you think, right? Mm-hmm. About the different paths to learning.
Definitely. Okay, so we've got books, education. What else is Johnson exploring in terms of everyday life?
Well, he also talks about the widespread use of opium.
Opium?
Yeah, it was a common remedy for all sorts of ailments back then.
Like a medicine?
Sort of, but it was also used recreationally. Johnson even mentions that, like William Wilberforce and King George IV, they were likely opium users.
So even those in power, they weren't immune to, the allure of drugs.
It's a theme that, it's still relevant today.
Definitely. Okay, so we've talked a lot about changes within nations, but what about the global landscape? What's happening there?
Johnson, he shifts our focus to that as well. This period sees the expansion of European influence around the world, especially in Asia. He examines the British East India Company.
The British East India Company, weren't they like a trading company?
Well, they were much more than that. They had this vast trading network, a private army. They were basically a state within a state.
Wow, that's a lot of power.
Tons of power, especially in India. They influenced politics, economics, even culture.
I can imagine. So their impact on India must have been huge.
Huge. Positive and negative consequences that, they're still felt today.
It's always interesting how these historical events continue to shape the world we live in.
It is. And alongside their dealings in India, the British, they're also trying to deal with China.
China.
Yeah. But China, they were pretty closed off to Western trade and influence at this time.
Why is that? Why were they so resistant to the West?
China, they had this long history, this sense of cultural superiority. They didn't really see the point of, engaging with these Western powers.
It's like they saw themselves as the center of the world and everyone else was, well, kind of irrelevant.
Exactly. And this clash of cultures, it eventually leads to the Opium Wars in the 19th century. Not a great chapter in history.
No, not at all. It's a reminder that, well, that globalization has always had its dark side.
It's a complex process, right? Winners and losers, consequences that, well, they can ripple through generations. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Paul Johnson's The Birth of the Modern, I'm struck by how much this era, even though it was centuries ago, feels relevant to our lives today.
It's like we're still dealing with the same fundamental questions and challenges, aren't we?
I think so. Political divisions, social inequalities, technological disruptions, the tension between tradition and modernity, it's all still playing out.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding who we are today.
Exactly. So if you're interested in exploring this period further, I highly recommend checking out Paul Johnson's The Birth of the Modern.
It's a great read. It really makes you think.
You can find a link to purchase the book in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more explorations of all sorts of interesting topics. We're always on the lookout for those hidden gems of knowledge that connect the past with the present. Thanks for joining us.